Ah, okay. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Elizabeth Finnis, and I'm an anthropologist and an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at the University of Guelph. And I'm pleased to be able to chair the seminar today for the Canada-India Research Centre for Learning and Engagement. Established in February 2020 at the University of Guelph, the Canada-India Research Centre for Learning and Engagement, also known as CIRCLE, aims to be an interdisciplinary nucleus in Canada for cutting-edge research on India and the Indian diaspora to showcase, advocate, catalyze, and foster an equitable, respectful, and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canadian and Indian scholars on complex, emerging, and unexplored topics related to sustainability and social and economic well-being. And I'll put the CIRCLE website address in the chat in a moment. Today's speaker, Dr. Sugandha Nagpal, explores the mobility, education, and self-making of middle-class Dalit women in the Doaba region of the Punjab. Dr. Nagpal is an assistant professor at OP Jindal Global University in India. She completed her PhD in international development at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the UK. And her PhD research explored the gendered dynamics of class formation and mobility in a Dalit community in Punjab. Currently, Dr. Nagpal is involved in applied and interdisciplinary research on migration, mobility, and aspirations. She's also working on a project on family resilience and mental well-being across low-income communities in India, Kenya, and the UK. She's also the co-applicant on a SSHRC-funded project on COVID-19 and Punjabi migration being conducted across Canada and Punjab. So I welcome you, Dr. Nagpal, and thank you so much for being here today. Before I do turn the event over to our speaker, just a reminder that we will have time for questions at the end of Dr. Nagpal's talk. And while she's speaking, please ensure that you are on mute and turn off your video. During the question period, if you have a question, please raise your hand in Zoom or type in the chat that you have a question you'd like to ask. If you'd prefer, you can also type your question directly into the chat and I'll read it out to Dr. Nagpal. And just to note that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the CIRCLE website. Again, welcome, Dr. Nagpal, and I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction and for the warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you, CIRCLE, for inviting me. So I'll just start with my talk. So you guys should be able to see a PowerPoint presentation. The research I'm presenting on today, which is on the mobility, education, and self-making of middle-class Dalit women, derives from my fieldwork, which was my PhD fieldwork, which was based in the Doaba region of Punjab, close to the city of Phagwara, and I'll get into a second where that's located. And for those of you that might be unfamiliar, the term Dalit references lower caste populations. Caste here is a form of social stratification that exists in India that's tied to one's type of work that they do typically, although those kinds of connections between caste identity and work are now seen to be diluting, but it's seen as a form of disadvantage and discrimination. And in recognition of that, the Indian government has affirmative policies to ensure the inclusion of lower caste as well as scheduled tribes. And the term, the lower caste group is seen as, the bottom of the hierarchy, and at the top you have the upper caste, and then you have the OBCs, or what are also called the middle caste. So I'm talking about the lower caste, and the term Dalit refers to a more politicized lower caste identity, which I'm going to be using in this case, and derives from the sort of ways my participants self-identified. I'm talking about young women specifically within this community that I will again sort of get into a little bit more in terms of details. This is a rural community located near Phagwara city. And the young Dalit women that I'm speaking about are either in the process of pursuing higher education or had completed their undergraduate and postgraduate education. These women were a minority in the community. They belonged to upwardly mobile families. And they were, these were the families that were able to sort of pursue a higher education for their children. But most families only pursued higher education for their children, specifically for their daughters, up till grade 12. And these women often pursued this higher education with the aim of migration, as well as among certain upwardly mobile families where education was valued. It was also seen as a pathway to government employment. And the kind of work that women sort of looked for largely after pursuing education was, respectable jobs. And these respectable jobs were defined mostly as teaching jobs or government jobs. So education here then was a pathway to some very defined mobility outcomes. Oh, okay, it's not. So this is just a table that will give you a sense of, the kind of women I'm speaking about. So these women were aged between 18 and 35. Most of them were unmarried. Two of them were married. And they, as you can see, a number of them have completed the MA. Most of them pursued their education from a local college, which was the Ramgarhia College. And this, again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, has to do with restrictions around physical mobility, where most women were allowed to sort of go to this nearby college. It had to do with both restrictions around physical mobility, but also financial considerations. There were some women that were allowed to go a little bit further to their adjoining city of, say, Jalandhar, to pursue their education. So, despite sort of pursuing education with these dreams of migration and, respectable employment, very few women were able to migrate as a result of marriage migration or secure government employment. And here, marriage migration became the main pathway to migration. Even though young women often talked about independent trajectories to migration, it was well recognized that marriage was, again, the most respectable way to migrate oneself. And the difficulties in sort of attaining these outcomes, whether it's migration or secure government employment, reflects continuities and historical disadvantages that lower castes have been subject to. And for example, here, and still point out the mobility of Dalits in the neoliberal economy is not dependent merely on acquiring certain qualifications. It's also about, demonstrating one's educatedness, one's modernity, and one's credentials as belonging within that space. So it often has to do with mobilizing one's social network and cultural capital. And that's something that often leads to the kind of results we see where, a number of Dalits are pursuing higher education, and they, even though it's lower than the rest of the population, it doesn't often translate into commensurate employment and mobility outcomes, right? So most of these young women, while they were, located within the village space, waiting for, either migration or some sort of respectable employment to come about, were giving tuitions or doing stitching work. And as they wait, these young women often engaged with the idea of mobility. At an imaginative level, at a discursive level, they talked about mobility as the physical and cultural movement away from the village space. So here I'm construing their waiting as an active exercise. And this again aligns with a lot of work that's been done on immobility, which points out that, just because one is immobile doesn't mean that there's lack of agency. And so young women in this in-between stage are actively reworking their resources and social identities to attain status within the community, even in the absence of real mobility or mobility outcomes. So the question that I want to sort of discuss today is, how do women access mobility in the absence of mobility outcomes in a context with a strong culture of migration? And I argue that while education is an important pathway to migration and employment opportunities, it serves as an important way to carve modern middle-class identities while remaining in the village space. And that's exactly what I want to discuss today. So the first part of this presentation is kind of laying the groundwork and the context. And the second part, I go into the empirical data and speak about the two young women from very different middle-class families and their navigations around this. So the existing work that has looked at the links between education and migration, especially in context with strong cultures of migration, talk about how educational choices become defined by the desire to migrate. So people, for example, in Hyderabad, in Ali study, pursue the kinds of educational opportunities that will directly lead to migration. And we see that happening in the context of the village that I will be talking about as well. However, what happens when there is a long or uncertain gap between the pursuit of education and the act of migration, right? So what happens in that in-between stage where education has not necessarily led to migration? Is education then being mobilized towards other ends? And that's sort of where I locate my work. I'm also interested in thinking about, as Rao points out, the social processes through which migration and education interact to shape people's life, identities, and status in society. And I argue that young women's interactions with education are not simply relegated to the act of migration or to the seeking of employment opportunities, but also entail aspirations for mobility, status, and processes of self-making. So in terms of the link between education and middle classness, previous anthropological research has talked about that even in the absence of development outcomes or tangible development outcomes, education allows young men and women to gain status in the communities. And the most sort of prominent of this work is, of course, those done by Jeffries. For example, Franco, whose work is based on Bangladeshi girls and their families, talks about how young women are able to effectively use education to develop awareness of their wishes and needs and increase their capacity to negotiate different ways of being part of the society. So in terms of my field site, my field site is, as I mentioned, in Punjab. Punjab is a northern state in India. And if you can, let me see if I can use a pointer here. So you can see Punjab right here. And Punjab has been associated with a strong agricultural economy, low levels of poverty. Of course, it's a declining agricultural economy. And in fact, those of you that follow Indian news, you would have heard the farmers' protests that have been happening within that belt, including in Haryana, being supported in Haryana. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so within Punjab, I'm focusing on the Doaba region of Punjab. The Doaba region of Punjab is one that has very high levels of out migration. And many parts of Doaba region are known for sort of being NRI hubs. So the Doaba region consists of the districts of Kapurthala, Jalandhar, Nawashehar, and Hoshiarpur. And the part of Kapurthala that you see here is where my work is located, near the city of Fagwara. Okay. Punjab has the highest proportion of Dalit population and was pegged at 31.94% in 2011. The Doaba region of Punjab has the highest proportion of Dalit population within Punjab and also more pronounced forms of Dalit mobility. Currently, less than 10% of Dalits in Punjab work in agriculture, and Dalits often seek to consolidate their economic position through non-farm work, government jobs, and emigration abroad. So the migration story is very intertwined with the mobility of Dalits within this region as well. And amongst the various Dalit groups in Punjab, the Adharmis are the most numerous and have fared better in terms of education, employment, and other indicators of development. And the economic mobility of Punjabi Adharmis is complemented by religious and social assertions of the Chamar identity. So there's a very prominent contemporary movement called the Ravidasi movement, which sort of entails instating a distinctive religious and political identity for the Adharmis, or what they call themselves also Ravidasis. Now, the Adharmis are also called Chamars, and they've been associated with work on leather. So the skinning and processing of leather hides is their hereditary occupation. And this particular group is the Dalit group that I'm looking at. So they refer to themselves as Adharmis or Chamars or Dalits, depending on who one is speaking to. And also people who associate with the Ravidasi movement also call themselves Ravidasias. So the village that my work is located in is Cheheru. This is a predominantly a rural settlement located for 5 kilometers from Phagwara city. So it's very close to a city, which also will explain how ideas of urban modernity become so prominent here. It has 275 households and a total population of 1,529. There's a strong culture of migration dating back to the 1970s when the first labor migrants left for Gulf countries. Villagers often see the advent of this labor migration to the Gulf as having brought sudhar or development to the village. And this is in fact when they sort of through oral histories, when they were telling the history of the village and the history of the development of the village, the point of 1970s when the sort of migration started was seen as a turning point. And the contemporary trend of migration from Cheheru is of continued migration to, of course, Gulf countries, and this is labor migration, as well as traditional migrant destinations like the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, along with migration to a large number of countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, right? And so, there is a distinction, for instance, between Gulf migration and migration to other countries. Often Gulf migration is one engaged by single men, and it is a form of labor migration, whereas migration to other countries is seen as a way of acquiring movement to a big country or badi jaga, and over there, it's often associated with a permanent form of migration and entails family reunification as well. And although at the level of discourse, about 70% of the people would claim that we have family members abroad, through an informal tally, I found that it's only 31 households or 11.27% of households have family members living abroad. Okay. I'm trying to see if I can maybe get rid of this pointer now. So this is, picture from the village. This is the main road that leads into the village. And you can see that, it's a proper road. It's not a kacha or temporary kind of road. You can see that, they're on one side, there are these shops with the shutters. On the other side, you see a migrant house. So these migrant houses, and in fact, you can see another one in this picture here, they sort of dot the local landscape and become prominent markers of status, of aspirations. They're often seen to re-entrench the divisions between those who've been able to make it and those that are left behind. And so a lot of these households, are very luxurious. They resemble houses that one would see in Canada. They have multiple rooms, the kind of furnishings. And often these houses are marked as being migrant houses through the water tank that is placed at the top. So here you can see that there's the shape of the bird. So usually these kinds of houses would have either the tank in the shape of a bird or in the shape of a plane. And that's the way to denote that it's a migrant house. So these were very interesting in the way that people negotiated this kind of space, and the way that they related to these migrant households. They often became, a site for envy, resentment, as well as, aspiration. So in terms of, how ideas of moving away from the village were conceptualized by young women, so ideas of urbanity and migration were very prominent within the village space. And compared to employment, migration signaled a more permanent move away from the village. So of course, migration was, the sort of main pathway to mobility. But a lot of young women, especially those that belonged to families where, for example, their fathers were pursuing government employment, also gave a lot of importance to being able to access government employment. And young women's imaginaries of mobility often relied on specific constructions of the local urban space, the urban space in the West, and the village. And often these spaces were denoted through the term bahar. And bahar here, meant basically any space that was outside the village that was seen as aspirational. The West was created as a utopian space where one was not bound by the rules of rurality, was free to wear Western clothes, roam around freely, work outside the home, and earn good money. These images of the West, derived from the way in which visiting migrants carried themselves, were often they engaged in forms of Western consumption explicitly, the ways that young women interacted with the visiting migrants, and images of the male and female migrant that is perpetuated through Punjabi popular culture. And Punjabi popular culture, for those of you that might be familiar, really romanticizes the idea of migration, as well as a particular image of the male and the female migrant. And women often saw, the West as a space where they could be independent, not just financially in terms of their, physical mobility, and was often constructed in a very stereotypical way, often that one would presume. The urban space was often constructed through women's own interactions with education and employment. And the local urban space was associated with urban leisure activities such as going to the mall, shopping, watching movies, wearing fashionable and stylish clothes, and engaging in more open interactions with members of the opposite sex. So often, wearing certain kinds of clothes was denoted with being more urban. And I will discuss this a lot more when I talk about the two women. But there was a sense that wearing jeans, for instance, or wearing a top was seen as urban, whereas wearing a kind of long tunic with a salwar, which is the traditional clothing in Punjab, would be seen as more rural. And so these kinds of distinctions were constantly made by women, and also something that they navigated in their fashion choices, right? How they wanted to position themselves vis-a-vis the rural and the urban. And an essential aspect, of course, also of crafting these mobility imaginaries, which became a huge part of how young women identified as middle class, was looking down upon the village space as an immoral space rife with drugs and violence. And I will come to this looking down aspect again. So when we talk about this idea of middle classness, in this context, middle classness emerged as the enterprise of young women, and they were sort of, involved in this cultural production work. And very much, the middle class identity was constructed in terms of a movement away from the village, an enhancement in status, and a distinction away from the lower class other that existed within the village. And Lychee, for example, in his work on the Nepali middle class, talks about the middle class space as being separated from the vulgar lives of the elite, as well as the low class that is trapped in equally vulgar lifestyles of tradition and poverty. And these kinds of distinctions were also made by young women who would often talk about this respectable in-between space. And this, constructing this respectable in-between space was inextricably linked to discourses of caste, class, and gender that allowed young women to physically and culturally distinguish themselves from the lower class vernacular young women who was bound by rural traditions and norms. So the middle class then in Cheheru, in turn, in addition to this kind of discursive construction, was also constructed in terms of levels of consumption, access to educational facilities, and type of household structure. And I talk about the middle class in terms of three different families. So they were migrant families with family members in the Gulf or Europe, professionally employed families where one or more member were employed in government jobs, and well-to-do business families. And these families I refer to as migrant, educated, and self-employed families, respectively. And these families, in terms of how they navigated the requirements of middle classness, can be seen to imbibe two distinctive cultural ethos, that of migrant and educated. And I understand this in terms of how they spoke about the education of young women. So, and how they engaged in the requirements of middle classness. So, for all these families, as soon as it was affordable, they would invest in the higher education of young women. And here I'm specifically talking about college education, so undergraduate, postgraduate. But they construed this very differently. So for migrant families, there was a much greater emphasis on explicit demonstrations of wealth, for example, through building larger houses, hosting large weddings, or celebrating any event with a lot of gung-ho and a lot of sort of celebration around it. Education of women was seen as important, but it was not seen as a form of distinction. In contrast, educated families, where the members were employed in government jobs, would see education of women as being a form of cultural distinction. They associated it with this idea of jankari or awareness, and form of cultural sophistication. So for them, the education of women was tied to a much larger discourse about their distinctiveness and modernity within that local context. The other metric on which middle class families also differed was the level of security with which they could perform middle class consumption, right? So the level of economic security. And I'll be discussing, the two girls that I will be talking about and their sort of navigations. One of them belongs to an educated, secure middle class family, and the other one belongs to a less secure migrant family. So I'm going to now sort of end this. All right. So now I'm just going to go into a discussion of, these young women and their experiences and how they were using, the ideas of education to access mobility and construct these middle class identities. Okay. So, Somika is 24 years old, belongs to an educated and secure middle class family. She's the daughter of Balveer, a government clerk and a well respected member of the community. The house that she resides in Cheheru belongs to her maternal grandmother. The family moved to Cheheru when Somika was in school to take care of her ailing grandmother. The environment in Somika's house is relatively open and egalitarian. In other households, young women often have a formal relationship with their fathers and are careful to conduct themselves in a demure way. In contrast, Somika talks freely in the presence of her father and even feels comfortable enough to interject when her father is talking with me. Somika has completed her MA from a college in Jalandhar, which is a nearby city located 23 kilometers from Phagwara. And she's preparing to take competitive exams for government posts. She also teaches tuitions to children in the evenings. Many of our discussions center on the lack of female education in the village. Like many educated young women in the village who are waiting for opportunities for high status employment to materialize, she often complains about the lack of mobility in her career trajectory and expresses that it's difficult to sit at home for so long and not do anything. And during my fieldwork period, she was preparing for the Life Insurance Corporation of India and government bank exams. Unlike other young women who face greater restrictions around their mobility, Sumika has the support from her parents to pursue opportunities that may require her to travel further distances from the village. Towards the end of my fieldwork, Somika began classes for competitive government exams at the Ambedkar Institute in Phagwara. When representatives from the institute came to talk to people in the village about the coaching that they offer, they held a meeting at Somika's house. Somika laments that while many girls showed up to find out about the classes, no one is coming to the classes because they think that is too far. The classes were being held, maybe 15 minutes, drive from the village. She says, the girls here don't know their special coaching for competitive exams, like the bank exam. Even the other girl that went with me, and she's from a poorer family in the village, didn't know. Even I have been raised here and have the same education, yet I know these things. If you have to do something, you have to do it regardless of how hot it is. I have a banking exam for the position of a clerk. I've been trying for the last 5 to 6 years, but I'm confident I will get it. In this excerpt, Somika presents herself as a girl who, despite growing up in the village, is well informed, confident, and determined. She distinguishes herself from other young women in the village who are characterized as restricted, unaware, and unmotivated. Somika locates the other young women here in the village space while specifying that even though she has grown up in the village, she does not imbibe other young women's concerns and restrictions. This desire to mark oneself as distinct from the village, both culturally and physically, underlines the narrative of young women, especially from secure middle class families. In addition, middle class families often describe the village space as one beset with backwardness, immorality, violence, and drugs, and seek to distinguish themselves from this space. For instance, Somika's parents' concern about the social interactions of the village translate to Somika's brothers only spending time with sons of one other family in the village. And by way of explanation, Somika says they're from a good family like ours. This categorization of some people as belonging to a good family, while others seen as belonging to an immoral whole, reflects valuations about class. The category of good families is reserved for similarly placed secure middle class families, and the site of pollution and immorality is moved to lower class villagers. This illustrates the efforts of secure middle class families to carve a middle class identity that is dissociated from the stigma attached to lower castes. In order to better understand Somika's middle class identity and contrast it with Kavita's, it's important to place the narratives about education in the context of their family's social and economic positioning. In contrast to migrant or self-employed families, secure, educated families had better links with the urban space. Many of Somika's relatives lived in Jalandhar, and she regularly visited them, as well as urban leisure sites like movie theaters and malls. Moreover, Somika's father's employment in a government bank translated to a secure pathway to middle class consumption. In contrast, Kavita belongs to a less secure migrant middle class family with limited and unreliable access to economic resources. Kavita is 23 years old and has completed a MA in history from the nearby Ramgarhia College, and she harbors ambitions to move away from the village space through international migration. She has also obtained educational qualifications of a beautician and caregiver with this objective in mind. While she waits to migrate, Kavita is also applying for teaching jobs in the vicinity of the village and says that in the event that migration does not work out, she wants to pursue a PhD. She belongs to a migrant middle class family, and many of the members of her immediate family reside abroad. She has three older sisters. One of them resides in the UK, the other in Italy, and another older sister who lives in Chandigarh. Her younger brother Suresh was unemployed and waiting to migrate at the time of my fieldwork. And while Kavita and her mother often claim her older brother Ramesh worked in Bangalore, the gossip in the village was that he was in jail for drug-related crimes. The family's insecure economic and moral positioning translated into weaker links to urban modernity. While Somika's family was able to use their access and exposure to urban modernity as social capital and demonstrate openness to urban Western fashions and food habits, in contrast, while Kavita's mother Kanta lacked the economic resources of a more secure migrant family, she displays a preference for claiming proximity to Western migrant lifestyles and her grooming and upkeep of the house. Kanta's house was one of the only houses in the village that I visited to have a toilet paper and mosquito repellent, which she explained was the consequence of frequent interactions with migrant relatives. But in her interactions with the village space, Kavita appeared detached from such projections of urban modernity. In contrast to other educated young women in the community who showcase their exposure to urban culture in their clothing, demeanor, and movement, Kavita appears to embrace rural styles with greater ease and willingness. Typically, young women from middle class families limit their movement within the village and look forward to planning trips to the city, engaging in urban leisure activities, and adorning more urban clothes. In contrast, Kavita is more comfortable walking around in a village, and her visits outside this village space were limited to when her sisters were visiting. The only time Kavita slips into an urban style is when she goes shopping to the local market with her sisters or with me. On these occasions, she dresses herself in a pair of jeans and top. This is contrasted with Somika, who would often don jeans and a sleeveless top, even while at home in the village. These activities position Kavita in different ways in the community. Often, other educated young women in the community express surprise over Kavita's educational qualifications and do not evaluate her as having the same social positioning as them. In addition, Kavita's conversations around education and mobility also reveal different concerns from Somika. While Somika is able to use her educatedness to mark her distinction from lower class women in the village, Kavita points to the difficulties she's encountering in negotiating access to education and employment opportunities. Kavita's ability to pursue these are closely defined by her migrant relatives. For instance, towards the end of my fieldwork, Kavita recounts that a few months earlier, she received an offer to work in a bank in Chandigarh, but she was not allowed to work there because her maternal grandmother, who lives in Canada, said that she either wants her to come to Canada through the nanny visa, which is the caregiver visa, and be independent, or get married. She refuses to sponsor or support Kavita's PhD studies in India. On another day, Kavita tells me her sister, who lives in Italy, is pressurizing her to get married. In explaining the power that is exercised by these migrant relatives, Kavita says, "You don't get it. Over here, people who live abroad and who make more money make the decisions in the family. In our house, the Italy sister makes the decisions." In addition, Kavita has to manage the concerns raised and presented by non-migrant family members. Kavita frequently refers to getting permission from Ramesh to pursue any employment opportunity that involves traveling to another city. She's also responsible for a lot of household work because her mother suffers from polio. So she also wonders that if she leaves, who will take care of the house and take care of her mother? Thus, unlike Somika, who has better access to opportunities and greater permissibility to travel long distances for education and employment, Kavita's conversations pertain to the obstacles she has to encounter. She often expresses a sense of helplessness and says, "Hum piche reh gaye," translating to, "we have been left behind." This statement captures the sense of immobility and stuckness Kavita feels as she navigates and accommodates to the preferences of her family. While both Somika and Kavita draw upon their educatedness to claim a middle class positioning in Cheheru, they occupy this middle classness very differently. While Kavita references movement to spaces outside the village, her everyday discourse pertains to negotiating access to education and further employment rather than using her educational status to carve a distinctive identity. In contrast, Somika and similarly placed women were more engaged in using education as a site of distinction. By emphasizing young women's ability to travel independently and pursue opportunities for education and employment, Somika is able to claim proximity to an urbanized or modern idea of female mobility. In her work with Manipur Chamars, Chayoti also asserts that upwardly mobile Chamar women are attempting to appropriate the modern that is linked to the city space while distancing themselves from the village. So through these sort of interactions of both Kavita and Somika with education, we see how both of them are using education as an important tool for developing cultural knowledge and status. And as Franco points out, young women's plans and aspirations and around education are significant because it reveals that the girls are saying that they can imagine their lives and themselves not only as mothers and wives whose interests and needs are embedded in those of their families, but also as active participants in wider networks of social relations. While Kavita, limited by economic resources at her disposal, makes less strong claims to educational mobility, the discourse presented by Somika operates as an ideal that is referenced and selectively emulated by differently located young women in Cheheru. Thus, in looking at sort of the non-tangible aspects of educational mobility, it is possible to see young women as invested in a complex process of social change and identity formation while they wait for certain mobility outcomes to materialize. Despite its inability to guarantee these mobility outcomes, education allows young women in Cheheru to access urban spaces, develop familiarity with urban cultural molds, emulate aspects of the urban middle class, and position themselves as the cultural middle class within the village space. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really interesting talk. We'll move into the question and answer period now. So just a reminder, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or type into the chat if you have a question you'd like to ask yourself. You can turn on your microphone and video to ask your questions. But if you're more comfortable typing it into the chat, then I am happy to read out a question. Okay, and yes, I see your hand. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, I'm sorry, Sugandha, that I joined your discussion 3 minutes later, so I might have missed some of the introductory portion, but thank you very much for allowing me to join this program. This is very interesting for me because I'm also a PhD student at Memorial University of Finland, and I'm also doing research. I'm in my first year to moving to second year, comprehensive exams preparation, doing similar kind of research that what is the precarious employment condition of South Asian women in Canada. So it kind of connect me with your research very closely, I believe. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I understand that's a very complicated research. So yeah, Cheheru, you said initially I had some questions like what was the theoretical framework you had been using and what were the methodological tools you were using, and mobility, at first I didn't understand whether it is inside the country mobility you were talking about, or it is, now I understand it is more about international. But if I'm not correct, please correct me, Sugandha. That is it you are talking, you said about 3 group of people, that is the migrant and the self-employed, and the other one I forgot. So you were talking about both of the people that who are doing immigration in the country or outside of the country, like you said, Gulf country and other countries, and is it like that who are also inside the country residing in India? So there I had some confusion. And I know India, and especially the because it's a Hindu dominating country, and the caste is a very important social indicator that represents any of the class in middle, upper, lower. So with this migration, do you think, like you told, gave us 2 examples of Someka and Kavita, so do you think, or what is your findings? Do you have, so from which caste group, Dalit, you said lower caste, so is there any change when they do migration? They have some economic benefits or economic transformation? Is there any social change? Because I still know Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, they all remain in their specific castes, but with this economic mobility, does their caste position also, I mean, I understand it will not change, but the social position, it is a very difficult context. So how it moves or takes space, the social status of the woman. Already women, lower caste people are in a very lower position in the society in India. But when their family members or they themselves move to another country, is there a very viable or very dominant change? That is one thing. Another thing was citizenship. Yeah. So because India does not allow, as far as I know, still now, it doesn't permit dual citizenship. So how they manage this space between a foreign country and their own home country, while they are not allowed for the citizenship, keeping dual citizenship. So there are lots of questions I think I have already placed. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond to that, or should we take some more?
I think it's up to you. I do see a question that's possibly related to some of the questions just asked. A question from Raj. Does economic security bring social acceptance and social respect as well? So maybe you could bunch some of those questions together. And then I have a couple other questions that are coming up too.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those very interesting questions. So just to clarify a few of the earlier points that the scene, is that, did I say your name right? Okay.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
So in terms of methodology, and I really should have mentioned this, it's an ethnographic study. So I was located in the village for 11 months and I was living in the village. And it's based on my interactions with the young women within the space of the village and specifically in their homes. My theoretical construct, so I draw on this idea. Of course, I looked at the interactions between caste and class, but the concept that I was using for this particular presentation was the idea of middle classness. And I use mobility in terms of the imaginary of mobility, as young women imagining the physical and cultural movement away from the village, and so how it operates at the level of imaginary, but also mobility in terms of certain mobility outcomes that then allow for that movement or represent that movement. So things like government employment and migration was always international migration. So I don't talk about, there are internal migrants that live within this village, but I don't talk about them. I'm talking about young women who are local to that village and who are planning to migrate internationally. And I mean, the question of does caste position change with economic mobility? And I think that links to the second question as well about economic security leading to social acceptance. I think that's $1 million question. I think there's a lot of debate on this. And there's varying views on what does caste mobility look like under conditions of neoliberalism. Does it mean passing caste, moving beyond caste, and class becoming more important? And I think in terms of, I'll try to answer this in terms of what I found in my work. So in interactions with these young women, they often used caste to talk about the projects of class mobility. So, in contrast to sort of the older men in the community, who were often politically involved with various parties, as well as certain kinds of caste-based movements, for them, caste identity continued to have a very strong role in their everyday lives. But young women rarely talked about caste. And it was, really for them, this, class formation that was, and which is why I use the construct of middle classness, because for them, it was very much trying to distinguish themselves from the lower class other. And caste was mobilized so as a way to move the site of pollution from oneself to the lower class other. And so caste emerged in that way in terms of the discursive interactions of these young women. But of course, caste was playing out in terms of the outcomes, right? So of course, there's historical continuities in the fact that, these young women were not able to access, respectable employment. Migration was much more difficult for them. They were not studying in very elite institutions, which meant that their cultural capital was compromised, right? So all of those, and networks, not having, strong networks to rely on. So all of those things were, of course, influenced by caste, but there was a discursive kind of dissociation, and a lot of people have talked about how as Dalits and lower caste attain class mobility, often there is a movement to dissociate from their caste identity and relate much more strongly with their class identity. And in terms of the question about does this lead to, what kind of development outcomes or social acceptance does it lead to? So in terms of their own telling of the history of the village, that it led to some very strong indicators in terms of economic mobility and development. Whether or not it leads to social acceptance is, it had actually, a lot of people have argued that increasing economic mobility of Dalits in Punjab have actually led to greater clashes between the upper caste Jats and the Dalits. So it has actually had it's basically led to contesting politically and socially for, same piece of the pie. And so that has not necessarily led to, positive outcomes in terms of social acceptance, but there has been, the context of Dalit mobility in Punjab is quite strong, especially with the Ravidasi movement, which is a very strong religious and political movement, which talks about a distinctive Dalit identity. So it's almost like, so this particular community, and this links again to this particular community in the Doaba region of Punjab. Other regions of Punjab don't have the same level of Dalit mobility. And also other Dalit communities are not as well positioned as the Adharmis, who've also done well politically. And this religious movement has also been quite important. And they've also appropriated a lot of the language of Jat dominance. For example, a lot of cars, you will see in Punjab, in fact, even abroad, where, there's the Ravidasi Diaspora, for instance, you will see that they will have terms like Put Chamarda, which basically translates to I'm the son of a Chamar, which is reclaiming and conferring their lower caste identity with positive attributes. So there's all these interesting assertions of Dalit mobility, but whether it is translated into positive outcomes is, contested. And I think that's what you also find when in speaking to these young women, that there is this negotiation that's very, palpable, that's happening, and trying to create spaces for mobility, but it doesn't necessarily translate into outcomes at that level. I hope that answered the questions.
Yeah, and what about the citizenship negotiations? Like you said, some of the families, they migrate totally from India to some other places outside of the country, and some of the people, they have their members moved to other countries. But some of the family members, like Kavita belongs to a migrant family. Her sisters are abroad, but Somaika's family is in the country, but she's planning to do migration. So I believe you have some other cases who might have some other forms of migration experiences. So how do they manage that? I mean, if they're taking citizenship outside of the country, so what their status? So if they're totally migrating from the country, so do they have any space in the country anymore, or in Doaba region, or how they compromise, or how they, I mean, negotiate the spaces between these two spaces as a migrant community? If you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, so my work was focused on young women who were in this in-between awaiting stage. So they were not migrants yet, and they're waiting to be migrants. So I can't say much about how the young women would negotiate citizenship, but I do know, for example, from interactions with some of the visiting migrants who had, who were permanently staying in the US, for instance, and would be visiting the village. So I mean, those houses are an indicator of their continuing linkages with the rural community. And they do visit. They come every year for a couple of months, especially the older migrants. And, I'm not sure about the negotiation with citizenship, but there is something called OCI, which is, a status, was something that I have because I'm also Canadian. So I do have OCI status, which allows you kind of lifelong visa to be in India. So I'm presuming a lot of them have OCI status. So in terms of legally, that's probably how they would negotiate it. Of course, there were many cases of illegal migration as well. I do think in terms of the linkages with the rural, I think a lot of the benefits of migration is premised on maintaining those linkages, that those linkages allow them to continually assert their status as the migrant. So without those linkages to the rural, where will they assert their status as the migrant? So that's very important to continuing migration and continuing the aspirations of migration from Punjab. So those linkages are actually very important to that migration story.
Thank you so much for responding to those questions. There's one in the chat that I'm going to read out, and then I see that someone has their hand up. So, and I see another one has just come up in the chat. So I think I will ask from Disha, what were the main challenges you faced in your work? And then I'll move to Varun, who has his hand up.
All right, thank you for your question, Disha. The main challenges I faced in my work were accessing the field site. So, I'm an upper caste Hindu woman. I just kind of waltzed into this village. My project was initially supposed to be more linked to the Ravidasi movement and a particular, sort of development project that they have. And I sort of was locating a village close by to that. And I happened upon this particular village, and I faced a very long period of rejection, of people being very suspicious of my presence, thinking I'm some kind of a spy. So it was very difficult to navigate access to the field site because I didn't go through an in-between, some kind of organization or NGO. I just sort of went by myself. But it was also very interesting. I mean, I think that also gave me particular insights, and the focus on women from upwardly mobile families or middle class families derived from that kind of interaction as well, because of my own positionality. I sort of represented certain aspirational aspects for that particular, subset within the community. So they were much more willing to talk to me, to discuss their, plans for the future, and especially the young women that were closer to me in age. So, it was, I think the hardest thing was the access to the field site. But then once that was, I think it took a few months. And then after that, it was very, very fruitful. I formed, very friendships with a number of these young women. I'm still in touch with them. So I think it was very, very rewarding. So usually the most challenging things over the long term, if they pan out, tend to also be very rewarding.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Varun, I see you have your hand up. So if you would like to unmute yourself and or put your video on, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for the presentation, Sugandha. It was very, very interesting. I had a couple questions. The first being, just wanted to clarify in regards to constructions of the West amongst the individuals you were around. You mentioned how different Punjabi culture and the arts contributes towards like romanticization of a different phenomenon. Like, I was wondering, is this more so an appropriation of Punjabi culture by more dominant, more powerful artistic institutions? I think about Bollywood instantly. Or is this something that's happening more at the ground level?
Thank you, Varun, for that question. So I was referring specifically to Punjabi movies and songs. So I wasn't talking about Bollywood at all. So of course, that's a larger conversation about the appropriation of Punjabi culture in Bollywood. But I was talking about Punjabi songs and movies that are consumed and produced, well, not produced locally, but are consumed locally. A number of these songs will show, men in, migrant men as sort of, acquiring some of these credentials of modern urban consumption, and that becoming a huge sort of, selling point or something that increases their marketability with the young women, and young women sort of, also showing their modernity and as well as their, appropriation of urban Western fashions and their way of sort of, straddling the rural and the urban. So, I mean, there's a number of movies that come to mind, and songs as well recently. I can't remember the songs, but the movies, there's a number of movies that were premised on this sort of migration trajectory where you see that, the man is, the male protagonist is always the one that's more rustic. So even though he's a migrant, he's still very much in touch with his rural roots, whereas the woman is seen as, emulating more urban modernity and being more sophisticated. And it's interesting that, these sort of parallels were also playing out in the way in which young women and men talked about migration in Cheheru. So, men would often not be, so the education, was primarily pursued, higher education was primarily being pursued by these young women. Men would usually try and migrate after, they've completed high school or even before. So a lot of those trajectories actually played out in the ways that, migration was conceptualized. I don't know.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that clarification. And the second thing I wanted to ask was in regards to specifically conceptions of the middle class and how, not conceptions of the middle class, but I loved how you discussed that a lot of the women you talked to, the notions of caste didn't come up as much. So you kind of talked about middle class. And I was wondering, in regards to class mobility, did you happen to notice if diet as just a way to examine the relationship between individuals and animals, if that played anything into it because of different restrictions, different what's considered appropriate for certain castes to eat or whatnot? Like, it did more consumption of meat influence how one was able to, how a particular woman was able to participate in class mobility or rejection of it? I was just wondering if how relationships of animals, I just use diet as an example, but if that had any influence on class mobility.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And that was, so I looked at consumption and in that food and fashion were the major things that I looked at. And, and diet was an interesting area because it was both tied to ideas of caste and trying to override and trying to create a kind of respectability. So a lot of people, even if they were not following the Ravidasi movement, they were following some other movement, religious movement, and a lot of it required, being vegetarian. So most young women were vegetarian, and the young men would often be the ones that consume meat or eggs. And so there was a kind of larger context of trying to establish respectability through consumption choices, and diet was the major, it was a huge part of that, and sort of religious practices as well, linkedly. But this, also diet came into play, interestingly, in the way that, young women negotiated the urban and rural identities or parts of themselves, where, there were certain families that, for example, I talk about the educated and secure middle class families that made an explicit effort to incorporate, food from other, sort of more urban parts of, India. So maybe things that people would eat in Chandigarh would eat in Delhi. So they would have sort of cuisines that was, more representative of different parts of India and something that one would more associate with an urban cuisine. Whereas there were other families that were more oriented towards the rural, so less secure middle class families that had a more simple and rustic way of cooking. So their cooking usually was very basic, involved very few spices, and they did not incorporate all these various kinds of dishes. And so there was, so consumption of food became a very important way of denoting both your cultural orientation and the ways that you identify with this idea of urban modernity. And your particular middle class identity that you're trying to claim, as well as conferring a certain kind of respectability. So a lot of the lower class families, for instance, were okay with consuming meat. So with this kind of respectability and trying to sort of not consume meat was something that was happening more with middle class families. So yeah, that's a very important point that that emerged.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Varun. And yeah, I also had a little question to myself about if clothing and house styles are markers of these changes. Are there other like visual or representative markers that people are demonstrating? So you just answered my question without me even having to ask it. So that's great. Now there's a question in the chat from Harshita. So she says, you mentioned the Ravidasya networks in the diaspora. Were women in Tiharu able to contact or access them? And secondly, what reason was there behind mobility being defined internationally rather than intranationally into urban spaces? Did this impact the imaginary of middle classness? My sense is that caste plays a role here, but would love to hear more about it.
Okay, so I feel like I forgot the first part of that question. Hold on, let me try and find it. Oh yes, caste networks in the diaspora. So that happened interpersonally, so based on people's family linkages, or if they were part of, these certain kinds of, religious movements. But my sense was that it happened interpersonally. It happened through family members. So, I mean, I can't recall people talking about these networks in, as a kind of, larger thing. It was more that, my sister might know someone, or, it was more very, very personal. And I don't think beyond these kinds of very personal linkages, I don't think while remaining in the village, they felt some huge access to the diaspora. I don't think they did. I think there was a lot of, even the process of negotiating your migration journey was very complicated because they didn't have all the information. They were often misinformed by agents, by even family members. So there wasn't a lot of clarity on, what is required. Am I actually fulfilling requirements? There was a lot of suspicion that, family members are not, making the full effort. Family members who are abroad are not making the full effort to ensure it's. And I think it's only so. I mean, the sense that I get, because I didn't follow their post-migration journey. In fact, most of them are still there, but their post, once if one follows their post-migration journey, some of the ways in which those networks become important might become more clear. But within the context of village, it didn't really seem to play a role. It was more through family members, if at that. And mobility being defined internationally rather than internationally. And here, largely because we're talking about a context with a very strong culture of migration. So the Doaba region of Punjab, it's sort of associated with NRIs. Phagwara is known, for instance, as an NRI city. So of course, there is that very strong, imperative to engage in international migration. But having said that, there was, international mobility as well, where people did talk about, especially some of the young women did talk about going to a certain place for education and employment opportunities. But, even while these opportunities were being pursued, migration was always playing out in the background. So it was seen as, okay, I might pursue this form of, urban employment where I go and maybe live in another city for some time. Although again, this was very rare. Most women were not able to sort of convince their families that I'm going to be, should be allowed to move to another city to work or to pursue my education. So I think there were 3 women that were able to do that. For most women, they were, they had to make those negotiations with their family, and for them it was being within the vicinity. But even when, this kind of intranational mobility was pursued, migration was always playing out in the background. So this was seen as almost a stepping stone for migration for most of the young women. There were cases of, in these sort of educated middle class families, some of the men contesting this idea of migration as mobility and saying that, these people migrate and then what's the benefit of it, and trying to assert education and employment within the urban space as being, a legitimate alternative, or for being, a better alternative. But again, this was a very, and at some point I do want to, probably write something about that, but I think that was very, it was not the predominant narrative. It was still a very sort of minority voice within this context. Whether caste plays a role here, I mean, I don't think caste plays a role in terms of people wanting to migrate. I think that that's very, I mean, if anything, upper caste want to, are able to and also want to migrate just as much. I think that caste plays a role in terms of your ability to migrate, especially to, countries where you get citizenship as opposed to the Gulf, and to move beyond labor migration. So of course, it impedes that ability. And also migration becomes part of the story of caste mobility, but I don't think it's necessarily shaping aspirations for migration, for international migration.
Great, thank you so much. There are a few more questions coming up. We are running close to our time, but I think we have a few minutes left to answer. So there's a question from Barrett who says, you spoke about the role culturally shaped mental models, narratives, identities, categories, expectations, judgments, worldviews through which people process information and make choices may or may not foreground caste. But you also spoke in terms of actual outcomes for these women where their caste status plays a role. How do you maintain a methodological balance in your work? And also place and space plays a role in shaping caste and class identities. Does the specific geography of the Punjab also influence outcomes?
Right. Thank you so much. That's a very loaded question. I'm not sure how to answer the second part, but I'll take the first one. In terms of this methodological balance, I think what happened as a result of my positioning in the village, in the homes of these young women, a lot of my data is on the imaginaries and discursive representations or ideas of mobility. Because I wasn't really able, so I mean, ideally, I mean, in the long run, want to design a study where I can study mobility outcomes over a period of time. So I don't think I can speak much to the outcomes based on the way that my study went, except say that, they were not able to attain the outcomes that they wanted to, that they aspired to within that time frame that I was there, and also when I followed up later. So I think that it is much more, so in terms of, I think it's much more towards the first part where I'm talking about these imaginaries. And I think it would be interesting to see how these outcomes pan out over a period of time. Your second part about place and space playing an important role in shaping caste and class identities. And yeah, I mean, the geography of, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by the geography of Punjab, but Punjab being a place where migration has become, a very dominant discourse and has been for a while, that does, shape the ways in which class and caste are understood. So class specifically, that, class mobility is understood very much through migration, through particular forms of consumption that have become more mainstream or have become, part of the dominant narrative through migrants, right? So a lot of times migrants come back and they evoke a lot of these representations because the kind of, consumption that they engage in, and they're very explicitly involved in, showing and marking themselves as migrants through processes of consumption. So, I mean, the context of Punjab and migration as being a very important metric of success and aspiration within that context is very important in terms of how class mobility is conceptualized. And I think relatedly, it then also allowed for, you know, a lot of the story of Dalit mobility, especially in the Doaba region of Punjab, and with this particular group of Dalits, Dharmis, is linked to migration. So they will, you know, in their own telling of their story, will often talk about migration as being very important. I don't know if you wanted to ask something else, but that's the way I interpreted. I don't know if you want to unmute, and if you want to clarify if I didn't get some part of your question.
No, thank you. No, that was a very good answer, very informative, very insightful presentation. Thank you very much. I mean, I think you answered my questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I think we are at 12:14, so I am going to say thank you so much, Dr. Nagpal, for this talk and the really excellent discussion that emerged from it. It's been wonderful to host you and hear about your work. I also want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today, and I invite you to visit the Circle website for recordings of any webinars that you might have missed. You can also join the Circle email list by sending an email to the address that I'm just about to enter into the chat. There, I've done it. If you would like to learn more about future webinars. This actually concludes our summer webinar series. What a great way to finish the summer series. So please do check out the website for fall events. And again, thank you, Dr. Nagpal. This was wonderful. And I hope that you all have a great day or evening, and take care.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for all the lovely questions. And thank you so much, Elizabeth.